It's hard to imagine Denver today without Robert Speer.
Robert Walker Speer was the most powerful and arguably the most effective mayor Denver ever had.
Looking at the city of Denver today, there's no doubt that Mayor Speer left an indelible mark on the city, and the City Beautiful era and its philosophies are probably still the most apparent and the most profound in terms of the way our city looks, the way it works, and the way it feels.
He talked about how it was easier to love a place that was beautiful.
He was willing to use any means necessary. No political trick was too dirty for him in order to maintain power.
But he had this dream to make this the Paris on the Platte.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library and History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
Denver does differ from many cities in that there's a lot of room here. There's a lot of open space. Even the poorest neighborhoods, you don't see tenement houses or row houses, you see single-family detached houses.
Can't be in Denver today and not see his legacy. You can't walk out into central Denver at Civic Center Park and not think of Mayor Speer. You can't go to City Park and not be aware of the footprint that he's left.
He came up with some really grand ideas. These ideas met with all kinds of opposition, but he persevered. He accomplished much of his vision. To this day, I think much of what we enjoy here in Denver in terms of the quality of the life of our city is really a gift from Speer to us.
Before Speer, it was an unplanned, ugly, dirty city. There was no planning, for one thing.
It's funny, I think so much of what we know about him is, and maybe this is by design, is all the greatness that he accomplished while he was mayor of Denver.
Robert Speer was born in Pennsylvania, 1855.
Robert Speer's early life was a challenging one. His family wasn't very wealthy. His father died when Speer was relatively young. There was a lot of sickness in his family.
His sister contracted TB. She came out to Colorado. Then the only known cure was a better climate. She died.
But he contracted tuberculosis from his sister. And he came back out in 1877 and worked at a ranch in the mountains and was cured of tuberculosis.
So while he came for his health and at first lived on a cattle ranch, I think he decided to stay because of all the opportunity a city like Denver presented. He was from Pennsylvania, where I can imagine it was a little harder to climb up to the upper echelons of local government and power structures, and so Denver really gave him that opportunity.
Once he was cured of tuberculosis, he went back to Pennsylvania to marry his sweetheart.
So Robert's sister and Kate were in a rowboat, which tipped over, and then Robert rushed out to save her, and that is the story of how they met, supposedly.
And together they came back out to build a life together in Colorado. Speer's first job after he was cured of tuberculosis was working at the Daniels and Fisher department store, where he worked as a carpet salesman for $3 a day. It was a very humble start for a man who would have such a great impact on Denver.
And I think in some ways that was good training for his future life. He became a politician, and he had really big ideas. He needed to sell to a public that might have been skeptical of what he was trying to sell. So I think learning how to sell something, whether it's a carpet or a big political idea like, let's build a big park in the middle of our city, in some ways it's the same skill set, and he obviously was a master of sales.
In 1885, Speer becomes postmaster of Denver. He leaves his post 3 years later so he could speculate in real estate, developing neighborhoods around Denver.
Colorado was entering its first great economic boom. The silver mines of Leadville and Silverton and Aspen were pouring wealth into communities like Denver, and real estate markets in Denver and other Front Range communities were booming.
And gets to know the whole city that way, selling real estate around town. and ultimately developing what's now the Country Club neighborhood, where his own house is at 4th and Humboldt. Still survives today.
He actually worked for Horace Tabor on some real estate deals, and Horace Tabor was the famous and infamous Silver King of that era. So I'm sure he learned a lot and had a lot of access to people in Denver through that position.
And Speer was heavily involved in a plan to develop an amusement park called Schutz Park along the banks of Cherry Creek. And Schutz Park was an amazing place.
Where today the Alamo-Posita Park stands.
You could ride a Shoot the Chute, which was essentially a large wooden slide that took you down. There were all kinds of attractions. There was a female acrobat who rode a bicycle down the chute, and it was also known for its diving elks.
They would take animals up and have a horse or a cow jump off a high dive into a pool of water. So sort of the outrageous things that happened at amusement parks in that era happened on that little space of land.
He then was appointed as a part of a citizens committee where he was charged with keeping track of saloons, con men, gamblers that you would have found in Denver, and it's really where he started to exercise his influence. So if you did favors for Mayor Speer, he would do favors for you.
1884, he runs as a Democrat for city clerk. There was a lot of ballot stuffing that year, fraudulent election, but Speer wins. Denver City Hall was on 14th and Larimer, where the bell is today. Speer and his cronies go in there and they're beating on the city clerk's door. The Republican incumbent refuses to unlock the door. And they can see him through the window. He's acting like you can't hear him. Oh, I'm busy working, can't hear you. Didn't recognize that election anyway. Well, Speer and his cronies take the hinges off the door, go inside, beat the Republican incumbent unconscious, and they throw him out into Larimer Street. Thus starts the career of Robert Speer.
And he served in a number of pretty influential posts. He was appointed by the governor of Colorado as one of the police and fire commissioners. He was an Arapahoe County commissioner. He was a public works commissioner in charge of parks and street construction. He could hire people. He could hire and fire policemen or firemen. And he was able to build up political support through patronage by providing employment to his loyal supporters.
You can only imagine that this guy was bigger than life. This is a man who would get a grand idea. A lot of people would say no, and he would say, I don't care, it's going to happen, and he would make these things happen. You couldn't say no to the guy.
Bob Speer always was a dapper dresser. He wore a bowler. He usually was sporting a large cigar. He was a jovial man. He was a grandfatherly man. And
he was quite plump and jolly, very convivial, had a very big heart.
He was also an optimist. There are stories that he really always thought it could get done and would find a way to get it done, whether it was above board or not, I think is what some people question.
He was very easygoing unless he was angry at you. And intimates said that Speer had two gears of angry. One was the screaming, yelling, cursing anger, and that was really okay. If Speer was cursing at you, you knew you were going to be all right. The other one was this icy cold silence. And when Speer turned that on to you, you knew that your career was over, that your days were numbered.
What really shaped his vision of how cities should be was the 1893 Chicago's World Fair.
Speer visited the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, a grand celebration of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in America. The planners of the Columbian Exhibition celebrated this anniversary by developing what they called the White City, this beautiful planned city based on European models, Italian architecture, Parisian street design.
Americans in the 19th century believe they have the greatest republic to ever walk the face of the planet. So they reach back to the greatness of antiquity, Greece and Rome, and do this binge building in Greco-Roman architecture. Today in the United States, we have more Greek architecture than Greece. We have more Roman architecture than Rome. So we showed those Europeans who's number one.
If you look at the turn of the century, post-Civil War, the country's beginning to rebuild itself. We have millions of immigrants coming into our country for a better life. Also, we've really got the startup in a huge way of the Industrial Revolution, resulting in vast tenements that people lived in. But there was pollution in rivers, there was smog in the air, there were all kinds of things that were impacting the quality of life of people in America. This was such a significant event in the development of planning and architecture in our country's history, and it just inspired people all across the country. Today we see the results of that in cities like Washington, D.C., Cleveland, San Francisco, and at the same time people were looking at cities which were not beautiful. These were industrialized cities which had slums and filth and grime from the industry, and there was this desire to also make those places beautiful.
It was a vision for Speer. He was dumbstruck by the possibilities of what he could do by taking this city beautiful model and applying it in a dusty little cowtown like Denver.
His methodology is best described as strong-arm politics. He would do favors for you if you did favors for him, and to curry a favor from Robert Speer would gather you some sort of good fortune.
Speer worked with the reformers to set up a new city charter, which gave Denver a very strong mayor form of government, which it still has, by the way.
In 1902, Colorado voters changed the state amendment to create the city and county of Denver, to separate Denver from Arapahoe County, which was known as kind of a cesspool of political corruption. Speer had made his way up through the city or through county positions, and becoming mayor was the best way that Speer knew to maintain his political base.
And then once this is set up, he runs for office after kind of designing the charter to empower a mayor to do a lot done. He runs in 1904, he's easily elected. His sharpest critic, Judge Ben Lindsay, the great reformer, claimed that he was elected with 10,000 illegal votes. And according to Lindsay, what the Speer machine did was to register the entire Kansas City city directory.
Paying for votes or rewarding people with buying them drinks for votes. Mayor Speer was accused of using those dynamics to get elected the first time.
Speer was able also to get the vice vote. We had over 1,100 prostitutes, 17 opium dens were operating out of there.
To say there was a little controversy in Mayor Speer's first election is a massive understatement. Speer won that first election with perhaps 10 or 15,000 fraudulent votes.
Robert Speer really entered politics at a time when maybe politics across the country was not as clean as we would want to think that it should be.
As much as everyday people loved Bob Speer, reformers were appalled that this political boss would acquire and hold on to power, and yet Bob Speer did it again and again. He was willing to acquire and maintain power by whatever means necessary.
He was elected in 1904, re-elected in 1908. In 1912, people were accusing him of corruption and all kinds of charges, so he said, okay, you take over, see what you can do. He didn't run. Progressive reformers ran, and in 4 years, they got nothing accomplished. So in 1916, Speer runs again. This time, all four newspapers, which had opposed him as a crook earlier, the Post, the News, the Times, the Denver Republican, all support him. And according to all accounts, in 1916, he actually runs an honest election with the idea, the theme of let him finish his dream, let him finish transforming Denver into this city beautiful.
Here's the crazy thing about Mayor Speer. He was willing to use any means necessary. No political trick was too dirty for him in order to maintain power. But the reason he maintained power was altruistic. He really believed in a vision of a better Denver.
The City Beautiful era is generally thought to have had influence from really 1893 at the World's Fair until about 1941, until about World War II. And those are the years that the core of Denver and what we think of as the heart of Denver were growing. Civic Center Park, of course, is still the heart of the city, and that was really the brainchild of Mayor Speer and something that he worked for passionately throughout his years as mayor.
The most controversial of Speer's projects was Civic Center Park. This working class neighborhood that had to be completely removed and clear cut in order to create this monumental anchor of government. For one thing, he ran out of money on this project very early, and after they cleared out the neighborhood, Denverites were confronted with essentially a large empty lot for a number of years. In the blizzard of 1913, the city piled all of this removed snow into great mounds in the middle of what became Civic Center Park. They called it Speer's Lagoon when it began to melt. But Civic Center was the anchor point of Speer's entire vision for Denver, this crisscross axis of government buildings and public buildings anchored by the state capitol and by ultimately a grand vision of a city and county building for Denver.
What people were trying to do at that time was that they were trying to connect this Republican, democratic society to the founders of Republican and democratic government. So they were going all the way back to Greece, where democracy was founded, Rome, a republic.
He saw it through each time. The voters actually turned it down a couple of times because of the expense to acquire the land, to clear the land. One of the key tenets of the City Beautiful movement was the idea that you would cluster government and civic buildings together. He also worked very closely with state officials because, of course, the state capitol is also part of the Civic Center complex. And they had an arts commission, a Denver Arts Commission, as well as a state art commission that worked together. The idea was that all the buildings around Civic Center Park would reflect the City Beautiful ideals and the classical architecture.
He began hiring architects to design monumental civic architecture. And when he couldn't find architects necessarily, he basically just appropriated buildings from the old Columbian exhibition. The Voorhees Memorial in Civic Center, for example, was actually a building that was originally built in Chicago for the exhibition. He simply took the plan and rebuilt it again in Denver because it fit his vision of what the city should be.
And really the idea behind that was to be the formal gateway into the park from downtown. One of the other structures that's on the park is the Carnegie Library. It was a gift from Andrew Carnegie to the city of Denver to build that library.
The state capitol was started in the 1880s and 1890s, but it took a long time to build. There were some starts and stops, so it wasn't really considered all the way finished until 1908. And so that was during Mayor Speer's era. It was during his era that the gold was placed on the dome. Originally, the dome was not gold.
One of the other projects that Mayor Speer was really instrumental in bringing to Denver was what was called at that time the Municipal Auditorium. It's today the area where we have the Ellie Calkins Opera House. And this was part of an effort to really build more of a tourism industry here in Colorado. Because of the auditorium, we were able to attract the Democratic Convention.
A lot of what he's done at City Beautiful is for the lower classes, for the masses. In like the Greek Theater and Civic Center, that's for free public opera, public plays, public performances. And these concerts, there was no charge. You got in free. Another thing it did, of course, from the business standpoint was to bring people into downtown. He had a lot of trouble convincing people. They thought this was crazy. A lot of critics said, what the hell does Denver need a Greek theater for? We ain't got that many Greeks here. So it was a sell, and several times voted down bond issues that he pushed to build up Civic Center in certain park districts.
As you can imagine, all of these public improvements cost money. You can imagine that the taxpayers were not always happy about footing the bill. So there were a number of strategies that the mayor used to implement these.
Speer was a brilliant politician who forged this cozy alliance with business people and with criminal types, and he brought them all together into this very effective, corrupt, but effective system.
Probably the most interesting thing he did was to push this among the wealthy classes and among corporations who he was giving advantages to. He also would push bond issues in certain districts.
In 1916, Speer gave a memorable speech. It was called the Give While You Live speech. And during this, he extolled people with money to give to the beautification of the city, and those folks are commemorated on that wall. So if you look at the wall, you'll see a number of names that we still all know who these people are, the Betcher, people like that, because they played such an important role in the development of our city.
Kate and Robert Speer represented one of Colorado's first political power couples because they worked in partnership in order to make the city of Denver better.
Robert and Kate were unable to have their own children, and so they really directed those energies toward taking care of the children of Denver, providing them with playground equipment.
Together, they were advocates for the greening of Denver. Every year, Speer's administration would give away thousands of trees to anyone who was willing to plant and care for them. Ultimately, over 100,000 trees were given away in order to green up Denver, and Kate Speer was very much a part of that as well.
One of his earliest projects, though, really was his vision for Cherry Creek. Cherry Creek, prior to him, was subject to flooding. Coincidentally, he owned some land adjacent to Cherry Creek, and he knew that the land didn't have very much value if it flooded periodically. So Speer came up with this idea of essentially channelizing the creek, putting up the containment walls that we see today, putting the Grand Boulevard along either side, and creating, if you will, something that would be not unlike something you might have seen in Paris.
It was originally called Cherry Creek Drive because it ran along the creek. He thought it was an asset and started the process of building the walls that now enclose the creek with the bike trail along them and the green space. And then they built the street alongside it. And so in his honor, the city council and the city leaders during his lifetime, and still during his term, chose to rename it Speer Boulevard. His critics, of course, said he had built it just as a great speedway for people to get from downtown to the Denver Country Club.
He doubled the amount of park space, promoted the building of a lot of public libraries, of public schools. They used to have signs in the parks like Washington Park and City Park, no walking on the grass. One of the first things he did was take those signs off and said, no, the idea is to have people walking and enjoying the grass.
He had a huge number of ideas and a huge number of things he wanted to work on, and many of these were being done simultaneously. But he did other things that we don't even really think about or that seem odd to us today.
I think at that time about 10% of the city had running water, and so if he wanted to take a bath, would not be something that would be easy to do.
There was a particular reformer here in Denver who said that children should have a bath at least once a week, and so that was the goal. That was the objective, was to sort of clean up this dirty town by literally bathing people.
He was for the working man, the working class, to make a livable city. Also at Denver City Auditorium, Speer demanded any play or concert was happening, they had to give a free concert or play on Sunday to the masses, or you could not book the auditorium. Denver Museum of Nature and Science, a huge expansion on that, and also the Denver Zoo. When Speer took office, Denver Zoo consisted of 3 mangy bears, and we're going to see Speer makes it, a legitimate class zoo. Our parkways, 17th Avenue, 6th Avenue, Monaco Parkways were done by Speer. Of course, coincidentally, all these landscape parkways led to subdivisions Speer and his buddies owned.
This was this Ford vision. He was putting in these parkway systems that went out to the edge of the plains. There were no houses there. There was no reason at that time for those parkways to be there, but he knew, he could see the future, and he could see that by doing that, it would create an incentive for the development community to come in and build these beautiful neighborhoods that we love today, these great historic neighborhoods with great historic homes.
And then throughout Denver, you see these red sandstone curbs along the way. Speer had those installed. Just coincidentally, he and his friends owned, though, the quarry where all these curbstones came out of. But today, they're still there.
Definitely one of the reasons that Mayor Speer was investing so much in the city's infrastructure and in beautification projects was tourism. Denver recognized pretty early on that one of its chief assets was the ability to attract visitors because of the beautiful natural setting. There was talk about Denver and Colorado being sort of the Switzerland of America, that this is where people would come to see the mountains.
He was responsible for at least starting a number of parks that we love and cherish today. One of them was Cheeseman Park. Cheeseman Park actually started out as a cemetery.
When Cheeseman Park is turned into a park, they remove the bodies to Riverside Cemetery, to Fairmount Cemetery, Mount Olivet Cemetery. And McGovern, the undertaker, was paid, I think, $1 a body. Supposedly there were all kinds of charges. He'd move a finger at a time or a toe at a time and charge the city $1. And he didn't get all the bodies. Some of them were unmarked graves.
You'll see classic City Beautiful elements to that park. The pavilion in the center of the park is a beautiful neoclassical structure.
So Mayor Speer's City Beautiful vision for Denver really had a lot of components, but really 3 main drivers. The idea of creating an orderly and beautiful civic center at the heart of the city, building parks and parkways to radiate out from that and to make our neighborhoods beautiful and great places to live. And then building the mountain park system so that people in Denver would have access to nature and the ability to get out into the mountains and also to promote that to tourists.
Some 15,000 acres of parkland outside the city and county of Denver.
So in May of 1918, Mayor Speer actually got up and walked into work, which was quite a walk. He lived in the country club area, but by the afternoon he wasn't feeling well and went home early and never came back and died of pneumonia later that evening.
The influenza epidemic of 1918 and 19 was one of the great tragic pandemics of American history. Speer was an early contractor of influenza, and it's hard to tell if his weakness because of tuberculosis was actually a contributing factor.
Mayor Speer did not live to see a fully realized civic center or to even see all of the parks and parkways constructed. He knew that the vision was on its way and he had seen the work begin, but he didn't get to see the whole thing.
So today you see something that I think Speer would be absolutely proud of, a beautifully restored park.
Today I think preservation is as important as it ever was.
It's very important to preserve Mayor Speer's legacy. It's a grandeur, it's an ambition, it's a dream of making Denver the Athens of the West, the Rome of the Rockies, this great neoclassical tradition. And particularly appealing is the interest in common people. You're not building for the private sector, you know, grand mansions and country clubs and private drives and whatnot, but this is all open to the public.
So in 2012, Civic Center became a National Historic Landmark. There are only, in the entire country, there are only about 2,000 properties on that list. It is one of the great examples of city beautiful architecture and design in our country.
We've been really lucky to have modern mayors who have also shared his vision and commitment to expanding our park system and protecting them. And the buildings that Mayor Speer and the structures that he's created are really some of the most iconic.
And I actually think you can go back to something Speer actually said. He talked about how it was easier to love a place that was beautiful.
It's hard to deny the impact that he had, despite his somewhat controversial legacy. He probably proved his critics wrong.
Robert Speer built Denver. He wanted his city to benefit everyone. He wanted the public amenities, the parks, the plays, the open spaces to be available to all. That was democracy for Speer. That was the openness that he believed in. And if it took corruption in order to maintain the power to provide that openness, well, he was willing to go along with that too.